Hi, everyone. Before we get started with season 4 of Jung in the World, I just want to make a couple announcements. First, we're making some changes to help differentiate our shows from each other aesthetically, so you'll notice that each show now will have its own individual music provided by Peter Demuth, unless otherwise noted. Also, we've opened registration for an in-person program with Stephen Forrest, author of a dozen astrological bestsellers, including his classic, The Inner Sky. He will be joined by Jungian analyst Boris Matthews, and that will be at Grace Place, close to the Institute in downtown Chicago on December 13th. CDs are available, and the program will be recorded. So if you are not able to attend in-person programs, if you live far away, join our mailing list to be informed when the video becomes available. Thanks.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung in the World, a podcast of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Being born the son of a Protestant minister, it's possible to say that Carl Jung had a lifelong interest in divine presence and how gods and spirits become vivid in our lives. And Jung studied both Eastern and Western religious practices, as well as those practices of indigenous people. He is credited for guiding Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, to address the spiritual needs of its members, resulting in the third step of the 12-step program, which calls the higher power. Given the range of Carl Jung's interest in God and invisible forces, I invited Tanya Luhrmann onto Jung in the World. She is an anthropologist who has written several books about how people access the spiritual realm. Tanya Marie Luhrmann is the Albert Ray Lang Professor of Anthropology at Stanford University, with a courtesy appointment in psychology. Her work focuses on the edge of experience, on voices, visions, and the world of the supernatural, as well as the world of psychosis. Her work has taken her around the world to study rituals, communities of faith, sacred rites of passage, and practices of magic as well. At the heart of her work is the sense of being called and its possibilities and burdens. She was named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2007. She was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2022. Her book, When God Talks Back, was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and it was awarded the Grawemeyer Prize. That's a $100,000 award given by the University of Louisville. She has published over 30 op-eds in the New York Times. Her work has been featured in the New Yorker, the Times Literary Supplement, Science News, and many other publications. She's the author of several books, but today she's here to talk with us about her book, How God Becomes Real. Welcome, Tanya. It's great to have you on Jung in the World.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I was reading How God Becomes Real, and I was struck by the depth and breadth of your work on this topic of how people enact their beliefs about God and experience the presence of God and spirits. I could sense that there was a sense of passion and commitment bubbling beneath the prose. And I thought to myself, I want to ask her, at what point do you remember the moment in your life when, of all the things you could have studied in anthropology, you said, oh, this is for me?
Well, it's a good question. I think I came to that decision when I was in college, and I was encountering explanations for why people believed in magic that had to do with kind of philosophical ideas about science and explanation. And I was intrigued by those, but I thought that they didn't really capture what was at the heart of people's interest in these domains, and that I wanted to understand more about that.
Interesting. So another thing I noticed about your writing is you write with such great ease about topics that I think William James famously said are ineffable. They are very difficult to capture. And yet, your writing is flowing. And I had to wonder, is this mastery on your part? You've just been writing about these topics for so long, or are you chiseling it out every time?
Well, the great essayist E.B. White once said that nobody in their right mind would be a writer if they could do anything else because writing is so hard. So this is the New Yorker's great essayist. When he writes, it's so clean and limpid. It's just extraordinary. And for him, he found it difficult. I think that there are few writers who do not regard the act of writing as work and as effortful and as a skill you need to learn. I really enjoy the experience of writing, but it's also full of many false starts and blank, pages of paper and staring at the screen and feeling inarticulate. I think it's just part of the process. But you get better over time. I remember being in graduate school and reading Peter Gay, actually, and realizing that Peter Gay, the great biographer of Sigmund Freud, had, when he was younger, used sentences in a somewhat more, he's a very good writer, but when he was younger, his sentence structure was more clunky than as he aged. And I remember thinking, wow, you can get better at this.
Well, indeed, you're at the top of your craft. I should say that. And I want to dive into some of the ideas in the book because they're very intriguing. I think to kind of start us off, you talk about this thing called the faith frame. And it really sort of sets up the whole book. So let's start there. Can you explain the faith frame?
So what I'm trying to avoid in using this term, the faith frame, is the idea that you either believe or you don't believe. So a secular person can look at a religious person and think, well, they believe in God, and that just determines everything they do and think. And I just think people are a lot more complicated than that. And so by faith frame, I mean a way of thinking that is relevant to, appropriate to, catches up ideas about God and being a person of faith. And that people live within at certain points of their life. And then there's the mundane world to which these ideas about faith are often sort of secondary or even irrelevant. And I see that, when people, even people of deep faith, they'll often treat their ideas about faith as being, they say they don't believe them enough. Like, the person wants to be a fully faithful person, to really believe that God is real. And then they're like sitting in their car and they're yelling at their kids, or they're washing the dishes, or they're worrying about how to pay for summer camp. And it's, and all this God stuff isn't so accessible. So by frame, I mean the package of ideas and attitudes and orientations that people reach out to and sort of frame their way of thinking when they're in that mode of being faithful, and then, and sometimes is less available to them. The other thing I think drew me to this idea is the observation that you can talk to, like, I spent a bunch of time with evangelical Christians. You can talk to evangelical Christians and they are very clear that they believe in God. God is absolutely true for them and God can do everything and but they never ask God to feed the dog, right? So there's always, even with these commitments, it's a whole way of proceeding and being in the world where they're not really acting as if they believed all those faith relevant ideas. There's something a little different going on. It's as if people are kind of trying to live within this understanding of the world that just slips away again and again and again.
Well, there's something about how I guess I want to call it the mechanics of this work, though. In this, it slips away. You also have this concept of kindling. And I guess at this point I should come forward and say that I am a person with a prayer practice. And so I got this right away, this kindling thing. But I would love our listeners to understand it.
So I set up this idea that there's sort of a faith frame and then there's a mundane way of experiencing the world. And many people of faith want to live more within the world as they understand it within their faith frame. So how do you do that? Well, that's sort of the work of faith. That's what happens as you practice, as you become part of a community, as you're working with people, as you're in your community. And I try to set out the things that I see, and I'm sure there are many more things than I describe, but I try to set out the things that I see that help the faith frame to feel real and present for people, in particular ways that God comes to feel real for people. And the concept of kindling is the observation that with different kinds of practices, with different kinds of expectations and different ways of thinking, these ideas and the experience of God comes to feel more real. And there are really two things that the idea of kindling brings to the table. First of all, that there's a change over time, and there's often talent and training in that process, in which there's a change over time, and the idea of God and the ideas around God come to feel more real. The second thing is that there's a lot of variation from community to community, from person to person, about who God becomes for people. So Thai Buddhists kindle a religious world, a world of faith, in which they don't particularly like to be startled, and they value being very calm. And many people with a big monotheistic God, like a Christian, they value being startled because it becomes evidence that there is this other person who is there, that they're not controlling, who really exists, who's saying things to them that they didn't anticipate in advance. It helps God to feel more present to them.
That is, it's one of the things that I think people, now that we live in a very digital culture, don't necessarily understand is the work of faith. The putting one twig after another to build the fire, to kindle the fire, that rituals and practice actually does make a difference to making God real in our lives.
It's these everyday practices, these return to certain ways of thinking that work for the individual, these reminders to shift your understanding of how you're thinking about yourself, this reach for periods of calm and relaxation. I mean, depending upon the kind of faith that you live in, or that you're seeking to experience. But these small practices, one after another, that really makes a difference to the way somebody experiences their world.
You have witnessed so many different religious practices and rituals. And I'm just curious, I guess this is a question of discernment. You come in as an anthropologist, but you have to immerse yourself in the community. I think Clifford Geertz would call this deep hanging out, where you make yourself a part of the community, but then you're looking at it as a scientist. And I'm just wondering, was there ever a moment or one that you would like to share where you witnessed a ritual that indeed did change you?
So, a short answer is yes. My first project was with middle-class folks in London who practiced what they called witchcraft and magic, and actually quite a Jungian kind of practice. And they would engage with these beings, deities, contacts, spirits. You could think about them in different ways. And each person would have particular beings that they engaged with, but they were practicing magic. So, from the outside, they are standing around in a circle and they are doing things, and they expect to get the house next door, or to change the politics in Britain, or to, get a job, or very practical things. And when I began that work, I was a young anthropologist. I was interested in the philosophical questions, and my friends were philosophers, and they loved this book, this anthropology book, that talked about why people in a traditional society believed in magic. And they had a lot of ideas about beliefs and about apparently irrational beliefs and, propositions that people would state that were not true, and from their point of view, from the observer's point of view. And then they would try, these observers would try to make sense of, why these people in this traditional society stated those kinds of, sentences, that which, there are witches, that there's magical power. And so I was spending time, I found a group of people who were very sophisticated and not in a traditional society, sort of scientifically sophisticated, and so couldn't be explained by the way that my philosopher friends were making sense of this traditional society. And so I found these groups, and I started to participate in these groups, and I learned pretty quickly that belief was not the most important thing to pay attention to. That it wasn't so much that people believed that there were these invisible powers in the world, and you joined together in groups, and you said certain words, and you did certain rituals, and you waved a wand around, and something would happen. It's not so much that they believed that, although they kind of did believe that. But what was more important was that you came to these groups and you did what people said you should do, and you did their practices, and you did their trainings, and you began to feel the magical power, and you began to have vivid experiences of the gods and the goddesses in your mind, and you started to have these experiences in which power shot through you. And it's not, people are not crazy. They're not foolish. They're not weird. They're ordinary humans, ordinary middle-class folks. But you did these practices and you would start to have these experiences. And I took a kind of agnostic stance about whether the magic force was really there. But what I could say is that you do the practices with these kinds of words and these kinds of ideas, and it feels as if the power is real. And so that became important to me, trying to understand, first of all, what's the array of things, what array of experiences people have? Is there a simple taxonomy? Is there just a wash of cool, weird stuff? What's going on? Can we understand what people describe? And then can we understand what people are learning to do, what you might call their training practice? How are they praying? What's happening in prayer? And prayer, of course, is a word that monotheistic people would use, but it's not a word that everyone, ritual would be another word. What do we know about the kinds of people who are more likely to have these experiences than others? People you might say are talented. What do we know about the way that people will think about thought? So many of these experiences from the most blunt perspective, these are let me say that more clearly. When you hear a voice and no one is present, when you have a vision and you can't see what you're seeing, there's nothing in the material world that you're seeing, but you feel like you see something. When you have a vivid sense that there's another being in the room but you can't see them, you can't smell them, you can't feel them, but you're really sure that they're there. When you feel that there is this force that shoots through you and you feel completely alive. And all these experiences, all these things are in the most simple-minded sense. These are thought-like experiences that you feel are not yours. So they are, however you understand the ultimate cause of these experiences, like a voice is some kind of mentalish event that doesn't feel like your mentalish event, and it feels like it's more outside of you. However you understand who's speaking, are they speaking? Their voice is not, that God's voice is not coming to your ears through sound waves. There's some kind of intermediary process. And so, anyway, so I think that there are a lot of, these are mentalish events. And so another thing that I think is really important is asking, how do you need to think about thinking in order to make these events more likely? So those are the sort of the domain of where I'm working.
And you talk about talent, in fact, in regards to this. And I am curious about that. You've met with shaman and Buddhist monks and priests and, rabbis, Catholic priests. I mean, you have covered the waterfront in terms of, different religious leaders. And I'm curious if you have found any commonality, like if there's one thing they all share in terms of talent, what is it?
Well, okay. I think that that's a great question. I do think that people who are really gifted and become adept, people who become really good, there's something different about their eyes. Their eyes look really bright and sparkly. But in my work, I have found that people who score more highly in what's called absorption are more likely to have these experiences. So what's absorption? It's a measure that was designed by a psychologist called Auke Tellegen, and it's got 34 statements, and you give it to somebody and you say, tell me if each of these statements is true for you or false for you. And there are statements like, sometimes I experience the world the way I did as a child. If I want, I can change noise into music by the way I listen to it. Sometimes I experience the world as if it's doubly real. I mean, there's different kinds of questions. I can be moved by a beautiful sunset. And so what's clear is that the more truths somebody puts down, the more they're likely to say that they've had vivid experiences of gods and spirits, that they've heard a voice, they've had a vision, they've had a sense of presence. You can ask these questions in different ways. They can come from different religions. They can be atheists. They're more likely to say that they've had they're more likely to report odd experiences. So what is absorption? That's something I've been thinking a lot about with my collaborators. And there's particularly this young woman, Kara Weissman, who has just been working around this question. So Auke Tellegen, when he designed the scale with his graduate students, he thought he was coming up with a measure for hypnotizability. So nobody understands hypnotizability, although there are many, many people who've made a career out of understanding it. I mean, and they all have smart, good ideas. It's just that there's this mysterious human capacity to kind of become engaged in something you're paying attention to, and you sort of disengage with the world around you. And as you do that, the thing that you're paying attention to becomes more and more real and vivid, so that sometimes the people around you can't even get your attention. So you can go, sometimes we talk about this as trance. Sometimes, you call it ecstasy, but there's some human capacity to kind of split off from the everyday. So absorption captures that, but dissociation, trance, hypnosis, there's an elephant in the middle of the room that everybody's trying to explain and understand with their own methods or their own discipline. So what Kara and I did is to give many, like 2,000 people the absorption scale, different backgrounds, different, they're all random people on this internet site. So over the last 30 years, I've given this scale to lots of different people, lots of different classes, and it always behaves the same way. And so we started asking, well, are there pieces, are there factors, is there an underlying structure to this scale? And one of the things we see is that, this is going to get a little wonky, but you can't take a piece of the scale and make it do a better job than the whole scale. So there's something about the questions altogether that really matter. So if you get all these people to fill out the scale and you look at like what's driving the way people respond, smart people can give different answers to that question, but the answers that we give is that there's something about being captured by mental imagery, by an internal experience that really matters. And there's something about willingness to, like, we could call it suspending disbelief. But there's a willingness at least to not say no immediately, to say, okay, I'm going to flow with this experience and see what happens. So those are the things that we think are important. I think there's probably a bunch of different talents out there.
But this is interesting because it's leading me to ask you a little bit more about where faith and psychology intersect. Because I know you teach not only in the anthropology department at Stanford, but you're connected with the psychology department as well. So I'm curious to know where those two things intersect, psychology and I guess I'm also thinking, our current culture in the United States has been called one of a therapeutic culture. And I don't know if you buy into that or not, but I mean, there are good arguments for it, that we have become a therapeutic culture. And so I'm wondering how these two disciplines intersect.
So what I would say about anthropology and psychology is it's more that I was using an anthropology only method, and I started hanging out with psychologists, and I learned a little bit about using psychology methods as well. And now I use both anthropology methods and psychology methods. And I think that those two disciplines are, very eggheady academic disciplines. I think your real question is, what's the relationship between therapy and faith? And I think that that relationship has always been close. I mean, so famously, Philip Rieff said that psychoanalysis was our modern faith. That was it gave people something to work on with themselves that previously they would do with prayer. And it's certainly true that what happens in a therapy session is in ways like what happens in prayer. People pray in a bunch of different ways. They have therapy in a bunch of different ways. But one of the common features in many, many prayers is that people seek to be grateful, and they seek I don't really want to whinge to God. You want to be grateful to God. You don't want to complain about the fact that it's 95 degrees. And so, and in a therapy session, particularly if it's cognitive behavioral therapy and, Jungian therapy, Freudian therapy, and they're all different. But often, certainly in cognitive behavioral therapy and often in other kinds of therapies, the therapist is honing in on the sentences that the person is speaking, which are negative sentences. And they're seeking to replace those sentences with more reasonable sentences that are often less negative. So it's less, so often people go to therapy and it's like, I am a miserable, terrible person. I don't see why anyone would pay attention to anything I do, and I'm a complete failure. Well, that's usually false, right? So the job of the therapist is to help the person understand, well, why do they say these things? But also just like, don't have that, don't. If you're thinking that thought, try to reach for the observation that that thought might be misguided. So, a prayer practice, again, many different ways of praying, but often people are trying to manage their self-experience. And that's also what happens in therapy. Secular therapy is pretty recent, maybe 100 years old, maybe 150, depending on how you count. And I think that it's doing for people what prayer can do for people. I also think that God has been imagined as kinder and kinder as the world has become kinder and kinder. I know that sounds a little batty to people, but because people are often like, thinking that we're in an apocalypse. But compared to 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, more people get fed, fewer people die by starvation, fewer people die by violence. There's less poverty. And so there's a lot that's improved. As the world in this blunt global sense has improved, God has been imagined as kinder. And so the God of the ninth century, the Christian God of the 9th century, was a pretty mean God. The God of the evangelicals is a pretty lovely guy. And so there's room in prayer to a modern evangelical God for a prayer experience to actually look exactly like therapy. I knew people who would sit down and say, God, I'm feeling pretty miserable today. Can you help me? And it's like, and then they have this conversation with God, and God reminds them that God loves them and loves them exactly as they are. People are, they don't really, you're supposed to be a good person if you're with God. But these conversations with God are often pretty therapeutic these days, depending on your God, depending on your faith.
So I'm going to ask you a value-laden question. I want your opinion. This business of kindling our faith, of practicing making God real in our lives, prayer. Does this make life better? Are we better off living with faith than living without it?
So if you look at the data, so this is a very egg-heady thing to do.
I didn't think you were going to take me to data for some reason.
So just stepping back, you're looking at it in some very blunt way. Look at the data. There are many, many medical studies. On average, people who have a faith commitment do better with their bodies over time than people who don't. So, and these, Harold Kerning pulled together like 3,000 studies. It's only 2/3 of them find this positive relationship. There are like 1,000 studies that don't find this relationship, but a bunch of studies that do. And they look at the data in different ways. They say, oh, this study says, oh, well, how many days a year do you go to church? This study says, what's your relationship with a God? That study says, do you belong to a church? How religious are you? So there are many different ways, and there are many different things those studies are measuring. But there are lots of studies that find a relationship between faith and cardiovascular function and immune function and less depression and less cancer. And there are many studies that have different findings, but in general, there's this relationship. That said, there are terrible religions. People have terrible experiences of their God. People who, the people I knew who grew up in an evangelical community who came of age and decided that they wanted more sex than their community wanted, or sex with the people who were different from than their community imagined them as having sex, or they wanted to vote for somebody who was different. I remember this person who just said to me that losing her faith was like realizing that you'd swallowed a snake that was strangling you from the inside, because you still had the God, but now you thought that the God hated you. And so that can be really, really tough for people. And a lot of the religious folks who talk about this will talk about being church wounded. You can grow up in a terrible church full of damnation. And so it's a complicated question. But in general, if you choose your God object well, it's a terrible phrase. If you choose your God or spirit well, and that can include like a therapist, you include the person who you're going to trust. You include them well. You trust them, and they are reliably trustworthy. This is the person who can love you, and you can feel loved by them, and they're not going to somehow turn sideways on you. And you can develop a relationship which feels like a trustworthy relationship. I think that can be really good for people.
Tanya Luhrmann, it has been a wonderful conversation. And I know that our listeners are going to find a lot of value in this. And I think that this is a great note to end on, to just say, as we live our lives, there is some value in believing in invisible forces that are good. And in our times, it's not lost on us that there's something we can bring to this individually to not only do better ourselves, but maybe do better with our communities.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you so much for being on Jung in the World.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above: Barbara Anand, Uni Alcott, April Barrett, Arlo Compan, Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, David Dalrymple, Kevin Davis, Dr. Peter DeMuth, Mary Doherty, Christine Foskett, Britta W. Jacobson, Mary Ann Johnson, Mary W. Liebman, Mona Manning, Patricia Martin, Horace Matthews, Kenan McKee, Sue Rosenthal, David O. Stats, Lawrence C. Tingley, Don Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, William Wolfe, and Ellen Young. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.